So, you know what? Let's get started. I just have a little
All
bit,
right.
a little bit of an introduction. I want to thank everyone for coming, including Sandy. Um, and we're starting another week of photojournalists who are covering the Ukraine-Russia war. So I appreciate everyone coming with their content. So we have a week of great photojournalists, and Thursday is the only night that we're open. But the rest of the week we have Natalie Kurzer, Sherry Kovanier, and Sasha Mosloff. I also want to thank Epson, Photo Shelter, American Photography, Pro Photo Daily, and Archive Magazine for always being around and sponsoring with us. So I love that. I ask everyone to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you have a question, raise your hand, not Sandy, raise your hand, and we'll field your question. Put something in the chat room. I'm monitoring that. And tonight we have Robert Spangle. So Robert, it's all yours, buddy. And thank you very much for doing this, Robert.
Oh, well, thank you guys so much for having me. And if you guys can't hear or have any questions, like let me know or throw that into the chat. I'll give you guys like a really brief kind of backstory on me and what brought me into covering the invasion of Ukraine. I've been doing photojournalism since 2018. That sounds like a long time. I've only actually done like a very few assignments with a pretty specific personal focus to them. I've been to Ukraine once before in 2017 to photograph a fashion week. Actually, I think Melody, who's in the chat, was there. I'm not 100% sure. So I'd been to Ukraine once before and had a totally different experience then than I did this time around. I talked to Esquire about going there in early February before Russia had invaded. It looked like there was going to be an invasion or maybe some kind of like small scale military incursion. And they were also simultaneously having a fashion week at the very beginning of the month. And I thought this would be a really interesting way to see how culture and like youth culture is affected by this kind of international tension. That didn't wind up happening, but shortly after the invasion, the magazine was interested again. So I went out there about 1 week after the invasion started. I'd only planned to be there for about 3 weeks to a month. I wound up being there for about 2.5 months. I was working the entire time for Esquire. Got a couple pieces out with them, which if you guys want to look up for reference, I'd be overjoyed. And I believe one more piece coming out with them and one more with Popular Front. My focus, because it should explain like why I chose the subjects I chose and why I have a kind of particular kind of focus in my work with Esquire, was just to look at the men who were doing the fighting or going to be doing the fighting in defense of Ukraine, and as much as possible getting close to their actions themselves. That's been the focus of my work for the last few years, is kind of looking at men and the often spiritual side that conflict and confrontation can have for them. So it was a really narrow brief. This wasn't like a wide general reporting brief that most journalists go out on. That was often like really rewarding, and other times it was really challenging because you didn't have much margin for error, and there's a very specific set of stories that I was kind of going out and trying to pursue. It was also kind of interesting because my entire journey getting into the country and being in Ukraine and also leaving the country became a kind of a preamble for the story itself that's sort of unavoidable. I flew from LAX to Amsterdam to Warsaw to Peremysl. I know I'm not pronouncing that correctly. And then it was a series of trains from there into Kiev about 3 days after I landed. A lot of the photographers that you've had on before talked like really extensively about the refugee crisis. And as you were getting closer to the border and closer to Kiev, like the waves of refugees, like waves of humanity, were definitely like piling up to like biblical proportions. I was in the trains that were going the other way, and those were like eerily empty. You had only a handful of men, maybe in each train, not even in each cabin, who were going back largely to fight. I ran into some of them on the plane from the United States. I ran into some of them my first departure, which was Warsaw, and then they kind of, picked up in onesies and twosies along the way. It was interesting to spend time with these guys and kind of see them being isolated and alone, going into an uncertain and definitely dangerous situation, and seeing how they handled that. This is like a period of like really pronounced vulnerability, and these were not, professional soldiers. Some of these guys had served in the past. Some of them had been conscripted in the past, but by and large, they were unexperienced, and these were guys with families, wives, children's back home. The first guy I ran into, had been living in America for 20 years and was going back because he believed it was the right thing to do. And, wasn't in the best shape, didn't have the best vision, but just wanted to help. Arrived in Kiev, I think on the 4th, and it took a few days to get like accreditations and all that lined out. I was really lucky that I had a mutual friend there, Maria Medvedeva, or Masha, as all of her friends call her, who became like my translator, my fixer, the person who made all this possible. So definitely a shout out to her. She worked in fashion in a similar capacity that I did, and strangely enough, she was able to like really step into this new role and kind of find contacts and talk to press officers and really like get the kind of access we needed to do this story. That was a little bit easier because, and this might seem really blatantly obvious, but when you see it in person on the street, it's pretty astounding. Like almost every single able-bodied man in Kiev and Ukraine was in some way, shape, or form contributing to the war effort. So it wasn't as if she knew a lot of soldiers, but she had a lot of friends in fashion who are now fighting. Former actors, designers, hobbyists, baristas, like these guys are all now carrying AK-47s. This is like one of the first photos I took. We found a territorial defense unit that was in the east. They were responsible for protecting a neighborhood and a strategic bridge. It was really surreal scene. These guys were building up complexes of bunkers from sandbags filled from a children's playground, and there's still kids running around. Looked like probably 50% of people had evacuated, but there was still tons of kids running around. By and large, territorial defense units would spend their days preparing positions and doing a couple of patrols, and then their nights they'd be patrolling really aggressively. To those of you guys that aren't familiar, the entire country, and specifically Kiev, had really severe lockdowns, or I should say curfews, from the very beginning of the war that were really strictly enforced. I think in any war, in any conflict, there's always rumors of like spies and saboteurs and espionage, but from different accounts I heard, more than 150 were caught in Kiev alone. So this was like a real threat. From about 6 o'clock onwards, the streets were locked down. You couldn't be in a car, you couldn't be walking on the street, and if you were, you're going to be like really quickly apprehended and asked some hard questions. And you could, if you're in a car and you weren't paying attention, you could very easily be met with like lethal force if you didn't stop. So the territorial defense unit that I spent the most time with was patrolling really aggressively each night from when curfew started until sunup, and then they were building positions again. Really eerie scene to see play out over what looks like a very normal city. They'd be doing cache sweeps, so looking for caches left behind by saboteurs or hiding spots. There'd been a lot of.
Are you showing images?
Yep. Oh yeah, sorry. Can you not see these?
No, I'm not seeing anything.
Oh man, I'm so sorry.
Robert. Yeah, you gotta share
Yeah.
your screen.
Sorry, guys. Amateur hour here. Let me. Okay. Sorry. Well, it's great. We're gonna get to see some
There you
great
go.
pictures again.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry, guys. I'll just recap these really quickly. This was the train in from, I believe this was Lviv to Kiev, and you just had a series of these men kind of in really like introspective moments. These guys are really thinking about the families they're fighting for and the families they might not, see again. And a lot of these guys were riding alone in trains that, going into the country were basically empty, and trains going the other way were totally overfilled with refugees. This is arriving in Kiev. This is the first unit that I kind of embedded with. I spent about a week with them and did a couple overnights with them. This is the neighborhood. They were suburban neighborhood on the east of Kiev that they were defending. They were filling all of their sandbags from this children's playground that occasionally still had kids that would come run out and play. They would spend their nights from when curfew started patrolling. Most of it looked like this. They had, very professional patrolling formations. They'd be right there in the middle of the street, and they were very forceful in the way that they interdicted vehicles that were going by that weren't meant to, or people that happened to be out at night when they weren't meant to. This is some of the younger guys in the unit. This unit was surprisingly older. The youngest guy was 27. The oldest was 65. And most of them were well into their 50s. So this is one of the younger units, sweeping caches, looking for equipment that might be left behind or people that might be hiding out. They took this really, really seriously. They were doing this every single night. I thought, maybe the first time it was just kind of for the camera, but they really kept up. They really kept up the pace. When vehicles showed up, these guys would spring to firing positions, and were really, really ready to disable vehicles and potentially kill the people inside if it came to it. So I think it really can't be understated how dangerous it was to be out at night and how serious people took this threat. One of the nights I was out, they caught a guy a few hours after curfew who was out with what they said was questionable paperwork, and couldn't answer basic questions about the area of Kiev he was in. So they kind of swooped down on this guy. It was a very high tension moment. Kind of checked his pockets, asked him some more questions, and then bundled him off to the police. Never really knew what came of that, but after this, they went into searching the surrounding areas for potential hiding places, or maybe this guy had dropped some equipment somewhere. That led to them finding a lock that they said had been forced to look disturbed in a house that looked like it was either abandoned or under construction, which these guys cleared out. Most of the guys in this unit are old police, or in the case of the guy here with the headlamp, counterterrorism. So even though they're old and a bit slow, they really knew what they were doing.
So Robert, are these images before the invasion?
No, this is 1 week into the invasion. So this picture was around the 9th of May.
Okay.
I think I started with this unit on the 6th, and I spent about a week with them. So tension's really high. There was, incoming airstrikes or cruise missiles while these guys were patrolling. And, obviously Kiev's been saved and the Russians wound up getting pushed out. But for the first probably 3 weeks of the invasion, people were really convinced that the Russians were going to be at the door and on the streets of Kiev. So there was a lot of weight to what these guys were doing and preparing for. There's a little bit more on that later. But from this is one picture that, from spent 4 years in the Marines. I'm really familiar with clearing houses, but I'd never been a non-participant in that. So this was kind of jarring for me. I didn't expect to be in this kind of scenario, and it was really had to step in the role of a journalist and not kind of follow through their movements of the house and really really hold back. There's also moments of like levity though. These guys are obviously like quite serious about what they were doing and aware of, what could potentially happen to them in Kiev. But there's also just like strange moments of levity. On the right, Steenert had 3 nurses who were volunteers. I was really impressed how well staffed they were. One was preparing like bouquets of bandages, and I thought that was for bullet holes. I asked her about it. She's a French volunteer, spoke English well enough, and she explained that Ukrainian military officers have the ability to marry couples during war. It's a special wartime power. So 2 of their members were being married, as it was a little bit more expedient than going the civilian route during a time of war. So she was preparing essentially a wedding bouquet. On the left is one of the squad leaders. I went out with him one evening, and he stopped in with a elderly woman who was one of the few that was staying behind in an apartment complex, and she had this house that was like a kind of jungle preserve zoo. There was just every kind of animal and bird you can imagine, every kind of plant, and I just thought that she was kind of an eccentric older woman. And when I asked about this, she said, no, actually this is people who left their pets with me, and people who left their houseplants with me. So there's this weird midnight stopover. The former counter-terrorist captain who's essentially hanging out in a refugee animal shelter.
So Robert, the people on the trains, were they Ukrainians coming back to fight, or were they from other countries with Ukrainian blood? I mean, what got them to come in? Good question.
So a majority, and I talk to these guys because I'm really interested in what these men's motivation is in coming back. There could be so many different reasons, right? A majority of them were Ukrainians that were living abroad. There was also quite a few foreign volunteers who were coming in, and that was more on like the flight from LAX. There's 5 Americans who were all prior military who were going, some to fight, some to try to help in some other way, but a vast majority were Ukrainians. So for this picture, this is one of the younger patrols. They were out at about, I think, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and they had 2 cruise missiles come in, not super close. It was like several blocks away. And I think they got intercepted by anti-air, but these guys really had to scramble to try to find some kind of cover and then assess whether this had impacted in their area and was their responsibility or not. So there's moments of boredom, moments of levity, and then also like these moments of kind of really acute terror. This is
Robert,
them.
Robert,
Yeah, go ahead.
For you, I mean, how was that experience? I mean, from
that's a really
levity, from levity to like, we got to really get undercover here.
Yeah, I think you just try to stay on your toes the entire time, and you try to develop a kind of reflex that whenever you are starting to get relaxed, you kind of bring your focus back. It just, in my experience, it tends to be like when people relax that something unexpected and bad happens. But one of the nice, like from a photographer's perspective, one of the nice things or charming things, I don't know, things that made it more manageable, was that Ukraine was the first scenario I'd ever been in where the people around you and the city around you were very receptive and on your side and hospitable and positive. In Afghanistan, that's not always the case. In Iraq, that was not always the case. Covering civil unrest in the United States, that's not always the case. Here, these guys are walking through these desolate city streets, much like in this picture, but behind every door is someone who's willing to help them, look out for them, and offer me like a million cups of hot tea. So that was nice. That was for the new things that a journalist had to worry about in this situation. There's also one big thing that I didn't have to worry about, which I'd worried about in almost every other previous case, which is like the people around you can be across a huge spectrum, and maybe they're not all on your side or on the side of the people that you're embedding with, and you're always kind of eyes in the back of your head. So that was a nice experience. It was really incredible each and every day to see Ukrainians really, really come together in like a cohesive way. This is a different, no, that's the same patrol coming back. And I think this is pre-dawn around, I don't know, 5:30 a.m. or something like that.
And are these folks soldiers, Robert, or they, just were taken in by the whole process?
So most of this is a territorial defense unit, and I'll get to some soldiers later in beds. A vast majority of these guys had some kind of prior experience. I think it was made out in the beginning of the invasion that the Ukrainian government was just sort of handing out guns to any able-bodied man or woman. That didn't really prove to be the case. You had to have some kind of substantiated experience in like just safe weapons handling. So this unit was one of the older units that I saw. Most guys were well into their 40s at least, and a lot of them had been police, counterterrorism. In the case of this guy, his nickname was Moskova. He'd been a Russian soldier. He'd fought in Chechnya, and like I'm getting his kind of story really roughly hewn because the language barrier was really pronounced, but was in Chechnya, didn't really like his experiences there, joined the Orthodox Church. The Orthodox Church sent him to Ukraine, where he essentially settled, remained a part of the church there. And when this invasion happened, he picked up arms against his homeland, which is really impressive. And going by his nickname, which means Moscow, this is an acknowledged thing. And this is a guy who had a lot of different loyalties to examine before he took on this role. The Orthodox Church, which has been divided by this conflict, and then also, how does he feel about his homeland, where he's originally from? One of the nice things about having a really, really narrow assignment was you had to spend a lot of time with the same units, with the same guys, and these kind of stories were, like, personally to me, what I was really interested in, what really was kind of telling about the conflict. This is after one of the later patrols, I think it was 3 or 4 a.m. Never got this guy's story. But this guy was, I think, the second youngest guy in the unit. He was something like 27, maybe. Former Ukrainian paratrooper. He's a flight attendant and gave up his job as soon as the war started and came back. It was interesting to see him kind of come back to like patrolling mode after having lived, a totally different life, kind of flying around the world. The last day I was there, they had an alert that the Russian armor was pushing onto the eastern side of the city. I think this was connected to the armor column that came through Brovary in the second week of the war. So everyone ran out to their positions, grabbed rifles, grabbed their anti-armor assets, and we're like really waiting for something to come over the bridge. And this guy in particular, he was again like one of the youngest guys there. Everyone else is, I would say, confident about it, but looking at this guy, he was really going through his head like what it would mean if a T-72 or a T-80 came rolling over the horizon.
So Robert,
yeah.
So Robert, you have seasoned veterans with really fresh soldiers as well, or non-soldiers, right? I mean, is it a whole mix when you're embedded like this?
Yeah, so this unit was fortunate in that they had a lot of seasoned veterans. They only had maybe a handful of guys who didn't have experience, or had like really marginal experience. I never really got to talk to this guy, but my take on him was that he was much younger and was only very basically familiar with firearms. And I think it kind of worked out because the older guys really taught the younger guys how to do everything. And there was a lot of like informal classes on patrolling and how to do things, how to wear the equipment. But other units I went to, it was like chock-a-block kids with maybe 1 or 2 senior guys. I saw one patrol that was like, they were high schoolers, there couldn't have been anyone there who was over 19, and they were being led by one guy who was in his 60s. And that was kind of, that was a sad thing to watch because you just knew what was going to happen to these guys if they got into an actual hard contact. So the road to Brovary. So this is where that armored incursion went through. The soldier here actually flew back from the United States. He was working for a tech company in Arizona, and he was part of the Army Reserves. And this is kind of where this is about as close as combat got to the center of Kiev. They conducted an ambush pretty close to where he's standing on a column that was coming through from Brovary. These guys really impressed me. Just the day before, their barracks, which was nearby, had been hit by a cruise missile, and they'd lost quite a lot of guys and still managed to stand up and turn back the Russians here. And this is, again, a guy who had a lot going for him and very easily could have, stayed in the United States.
So Robert, are you traveling with a fixer, or you're now independent embedded?
So when I went out on embeds, I was solo. If I had my dear friend Masha with me, I might have brought the fixer I had on board, but she didn't really know what she was getting into, and I didn't really want to put her in harm's way. Language barrier definitely became kind of an issue there, and I just I leveraged as much time into these things as I could. This particular series of images we were going from location to location, so this wasn't really an embed. We were just kind of trying to figure out what was going on east. So for that, I had fixer driver with me, and that made it a lot easier to navigate it. Something as a photographer that moments that I really enjoy are these kind of surreal moments where you think you've seen something, and mentally you're mistaken, but maybe you still get some of that in the image you take. This was a bunker that was underneath a bridge east side of Kiev, and at a great distance it looked like shields kind of stacked across this bunker, a la like Roman phalanxes, which kind of like I'd seen so many weird things today that was potentially in the realm of possibility. And closer examination, they'd taken up the sewer plates from like large parts of the cities and were stacking them as kind of armor. And you could see in these sewer plates, you can see this prominent K1 in the center, the different sewer plates from different periods. So the K era ones were from the Soviet era, and then you had more contemporary ones that had the founders of Kiev in their boat. So you had kind of the city's history becoming its armor, and then also just a totally normal market behind. And you also had moments where you were talking to these units. This was a field hospital that was set up in an amphitheater, where there were some people who were a bit more experienced who knew just how ugly it was going to get if the Russians got into Kiev proper. This is a young medic who'd set up his hospital bay, and he was really calm and collected, but you could just see by how bloodshot his eyes were and how dark the circles under his eyes were, how much he'd been going through, what the first casualty was going to be like in his head. Everything else about that position was pretty normal and jovial, and you walk into the medical bay and it was a totally different feeling.
And Robert, does anyone speak English while you're embedded with them?
I was really surprised. Younger Ukrainians, quite a lot, I would say a majority of them speak kind of like English that you can get along with.
Yeah.
And a good amount of them speak excellent English. Ukraine is one of Europe's leaders in tech infrastructure. Yep. And the language that is English. So a lot of the kids are totally fluent. They speak it better than I do. So if you're with older groups of guys, there's no way you're gonna be able to carry on a conversation except for like hand and arm signals. And I'd use a translator on several of these days, or found someone in the unit who could translate and kind of brought them along. But with younger guys, you're normally fine. Like if someone was under 20, they definitely spoke English. If they're under 30, it was probably like 60% chance they did. So that kind of, those previous images encapsulate like the first story that I did for Esquire, and this is very much when it looked like Kiev was going to get, if not completely encircled, then at least like partially encircled, and there'd be actually fighting in the city itself. After that, I found this unit, which is really strange in structure, but like totally central to my interest and also the brief, which is called Bratstvo Battalion. They've had a couple different names since the revolution. They're a Orthodox faith-based volunteer fighting unit. In the US, it sounds totally crazy, but this has been something that has existed in Ukraine since the revolution in 2014. There's been as many as 50 different volunteer battalions, and it's actually an integral part of Ukraine's defense and Ukraine's ability to meet, a much larger force very, very quickly. So this unit, they're based on the Orthodox faith. Interestingly enough, they really didn't care what Orthodox faith that was. So they had about 30 Orthodox Muslims fighting with them. And apparently they had an Orthodox Jew who was interested in fighting with them. So they were kind of in some ways like very old school and sort of medieval, and in other ways like marketing and the way they presented themselves and the way they recruited, really 21st century. They've gone through a couple different iterations. They're very right wing, and obviously like quite religious. They're receptive to having me there, and I spent about 3 weeks with them, going and checking different positions, and also going to mass with them. They held mass both in their field positions and also back at their headquarters in Kiev. What you're seeing here is one of these masses that they held. The tallest guy is Dmytro Korchinsky. He's a well-known Ukrainian far-right political figure. Never really held a lot of power, but he's a consistent political commentator. And then his second in command just next to that. So this is really interesting to me because these guys have a direct relationship between spirituality and the spiritual system, and that then obligating them to conflict. They had quite a few foreign volunteers, which you asked about earlier, Frank. They were really interesting to watch. They'd kind of newly arrived and were being promised that they were going to be put directly into the action very quickly. The guy with the face tattoos came over from the Foreign Legion, but was not Ukrainian. And the younger guy is a 19-year-old American with no combat experience. And not emotionally, but like I really enjoyed as a study looking at these guys and looking at the way they went through receiving the sermon. The sermon was about not being prideful in their recent military successes, and they told me it was really aimed at the younger guys who were joining to try to help them kind of bolster themselves.
So those other guys are hired guns, huh, Robert?
So they're definitely not paid. They're definitely not paid, but they're as volunteers. Okay. They're not paid. They weren't particularly well outfitted. The battalion has to raise its own funds, find its own arms. So the uniforms weren't consistent. There weren't enough weapons to go around, and there weren't really enough resources to go around. But these guys, they came to fight as volunteers, and that's kind of what they were being promised.
And any women?
So you definitely saw, there are women in the Ukrainian military, there's women in the territorial defense. In Bratstvo Battalion, there were women. None of them were in frontline roles. I'm not sure if that would have been allowed or not based on these guys kind of being Orthodox, but they were definitely there. They were kind of more running the logistics things. They had several women who were doing their kind of social media thing, which is an interesting aspect of this war. But my take on these guys was that, they had a few experienced fighters, really just a handful. And even those guys they were experienced in irregular warfare. These guys were never professionally trained, but they'd fought in Donbass and maybe in the revolution of 2014. So it was a lot of just younger people who really, really passionately wanted to be in the fight.
And what was their motivation if they weren't Ukraine to fight?
Right. So
the greater good.
There's kind of two groups for that. So I talked to at great length the Muslim volunteers, because that was really interesting to me, to see two Orthodox faiths, which we could really imagine being adversarial to each other, being in the same unit and really getting on and going into combat together. So I talked to the Muslims quite extensively. Some of them were for Chechnya, some of them were from other parts of the Caucasus, like the Caucasus regions. And they explained it to me like very simply. They're like, most of the Russian military is tied up occupying our lands. If we can help the Ukrainians win, then by engaging the Russian military, we're destabilizing their military back home. And they saw it as a brotherhood. Dmitry Korchenko, interestingly enough, is a larger cult figure outside of Ukraine than he is inside of Ukraine. And that's mostly with Muslim insurgency groups. Really interesting tie-in that I didn't really see coming. For the other Western volunteers, they weren't there for, I talked to them, they weren't there for religious reasons. It was mostly moral reasons. They felt that this was the right thing to do. They felt like it was something that they wanted to do. I wish I could have talked to the Foreign Legion guy, but there's just no shared language there, and it wasn't going to happen. I did talk briefly to this 19-year-old kid, and he was reminded me a little bit like Holden Caulfield. He was kind of like a lost 19-year-old kid and just really strongly believed that what Russia was doing was evil. I think he had kind of unrealistic expectations of what someone who's not trained can do in this situation, but he was there as of like the second day of the war.
And where were they from?
So the 19-year-old was from America, I think somewhere on the East Coast. The Foreign Legion guy, originally I don't know where he was from. If he was from Ukraine, I think he wouldn't have been to the foreigners, and he would have been able to speak Ukrainian to my translator. There was a couple other ones who were from Brazil, and there's a helicopter going by. Quite a few Ukrainians who were returning from Ireland, some who had been born there and were coming back. That was probably the largest minority group there outside of the Muslims. There was 5 guys from Ireland, and I think two of them had been born there. But I spent about 3 weeks with these guys. They were in high spirits. They were very aggressive. And a lot of them were like, 18, 19-year-old kids who kind of came off as like, being from the rougher side of the tracks. And just, they couldn't get into the army quick enough, and they just really wanted an aggressive role in the war, and they got it. That said, I kind of expected the worst when these guys actually went into combat. I didn't go into in Lukyanivka. I didn't go in the initial phases of attacking the town. A photographer named Oleksandr Novrotsky did, who knew the unit for a long time. He lost both his legs, but they conducted themselves like professional soldiers. They went into this town called Lukyanivka. Broad daylight, midday, backed up only by 2 Ukrainian tanks. Are they
repairing it? Are they repairing a tank right here?
Yeah, so this is a wrecking crew that came in immediately afterwards. Both Ukrainian tanks that went in were damaged, not destroyed, but damaged. And they wound up capturing quite a few Russian tanks that were either lightly damaged or abandoned. They fought it out there for an entire day, suffered through 2 nights of artillery, and then were able to recover these things. But the tankers were on loan from the Ukrainian Army, and really come across as like the heroes in this.
And do you see a lot of American hardware? Or did you see
I think this is too early in the war for that.
Okay.
Supplies were definitely coming in, but they were going to be given to the army, not volunteer battalions. I think these guys had managed to get an extra like hatchback that someone donated, but definitely didn't come through government lines. A lot of these guys brought their own equipment, to the fight. This is Lukyanivka. Really impressed by just the tactics involved with this. They didn't go for like the nearest Russian held town. They went for one that was behind enemy lines, behind Russian lines, but was more strategic. It's like really advanced for a group of guys who are not experienced. Just to give you an example, one of their team leaders, who was considered one of the most capable, his only prior experience was airsofting. And he was a 23-year-old kid. So really,
How long were
really
you with
impressed
them,
by
Robert?
it. It was about 3 weeks, not condensed. I would go out for a couple days. I would go out for like a maximum 3 days at a time, and then come back and go out specifically when they had actions like this. This is Lukyanivka. It looked like a combination between a wildfire and a tornado had gone through it. It was a small town, and on the main drag there really wasn't a whole lot left. There's also just unexploded munitions littered everywhere, which is a real hazard to the very few people who stayed behind, the soldiers who were staying there to hold the town. And that's apparently what very nearly killed this journalist, Alexander Novorodsky. So very wary of that. These are the tankers I was referring to. A lot of respect for these guys. They've been awake for 2 days at this point and fighting for the entirety of the first day, and then trying to survive artillery for the night subsequent. And at the end of this, all of their vehicles were damaged, and they wound up having to take Russian tanks and take Russian APCs, hook those up to tow out their damaged vehicles, and then get ready for the next attack. So it was really, really like just scrappy fighting. And you can see in this guy's face, like they've aged like years in just a few days. And the Bratstvo battalion was like super brave, super commendable, but definitely the tanks that were backing them up were really incredibly brave and made the difference. Ukraine's ability to integrate these different groups really impressed me. In this town, you had special forces, standard Ukrainian military in the form of tanks, and then a volunteer battalion, all getting along and working well and not accidentally killing each other, which is
and there's no hierarchy. I mean, everyone's equal.
no. There's definitely a hierarchy. The volunteer battalions are definitely at the bottom, and the Ukrainian Army would say, these guys are not in a disparaging way, but just as a matter of fact, like these guys are meat for the grinder. We know that they're not trained, they're not that well organized, and unfortunately, the best thing that they can do right now is throw themselves at the Russians. The Bratstvo battalion did so in a really incredible way, but they were definitely perceived as just like essentially like a human wave. Just a few days after that, I think it was 2 days, maybe 3, they took the neighboring town of Barishivka, which was larger, a little bit less strategic. These guys, the battalion had suffered about 20 casualties out of 130 guys that they sent in to take Lukyanivka. Not all of those were dead, but they'd really lost a lot of men and blood out there. So I was really impressed that they got back on their feet and went out again, did it again. Barishivka fell relatively easily. At this point, the Russians were kind of turning and running. This was a Ukrainian army, I think it was the 5th Mountain, that joined them on this attack and was holding the town once it was taken. This guy had been fighting in the Donbass and the revolution, and like you can just tell by the state of his gear and also his eye patch, like he's been doing this for a long time. The next town they took, and for security reasons, they weren't telling me what their plans were. So they would kind of tell me when something was going to go down as it was actually unfolding, but they were never telling me, okay, we're going for this town next, this town next, this town next. So when I first embedded with them, I really expected they would take maybe one town. That was it. And they took about 3 in a week. Novobesan was the largest of them by a factor of I don't know how much. It's also a strategically important town because there was a Russian battalion based there, and this town was actually outside of the district of Kiev Oblast. So this successful attack, was the first one to push Russian forces outside of Kiev, and it was done by a volunteer battalion. So this town was Novobesan. They had a little bit more Ukrainian armor behind them. I think it was 2 APCs and 2 tanks this time. They went up, no one knows how many tanks they went up against, but when the fighting was over, they destroyed or captured 20 pieces of Russian armor. So again, like just absolutely impossibly long arms, long odds, odds that the American military wouldn't want to go up against, and these guys really, really fought it out. This is one of those APC crews very gingerly going through an intersection that had a Russian truck on it that had been filled with mortars, munitions that had been hit by, I believe, a tank. So there was 300 or 400 unexploded mortars littered around the street that these guys had to navigate. As you entered the town, this was kind of the first thing that you saw was just a series of Russian tanks that had been stuck in the mud. They were undamaged. They were just basically, abandoned at the very beginning of this fight. As you got farther into the town, the amount of human Russian casualties became really apparent, to the point where even the hardened Ukrainians were getting a little bit disturbed. This was an intersection where one BMP and one APC had been ambushed very accurately, and quite a lot of people died in the vehicles, and quite a few Russians had died running from the vehicles. Some of them had died while trying to give aid to other Russians, and it was even the really seasoned guys there kind of didn't want to look at this. Very, a kind of a difficult thing to navigate. You can't help but look at these young Russian kids and realize that this is not how, even if they thought they were going to die, this is not how they expected it to go down. On the other end, you have these really seasoned Ukrainians who are maybe not as professionally trained, but have been doing this, unfortunately, for a very long time. And it was even kind of getting them down. This was the site of I believe it was a T-80 that had gotten hit directly with artillery and just totally eviscerated. And you could just tell from, the way these Russian casualties were laying in their positioning and the aid that was rendered to them, that these guys were either completely scared out of their minds, or they had never really been trained on what to do if they were ambushed. I spared you guys this picture, but this helmet belonged to a guy who had a really, really grievous head wound, didn't have much left of a head, and someone had tried to render first aid for this guy. Really compassionate, but also really foolish. The city was still contested and still being secured, so they did a kind of count on how many people are normally in an APC, and realized that several of these guys were missing. I was with them. They started searching the surrounding area and found a bunch of abandoned Russian uniforms. That led them to start clearing the houses that were around. They'd been broken into or breached. Either Russians were probably trying to loot just civilian clothing to either blend in or get back to their units, which is one of these, again, scenarios you don't really expect to unfold, but it happens. Just for context, for the next couple of slides, this was, another classic rumor of war is rape. Unfortunately, in almost every war, it proves true to some degree. This is about the time the New York Times broke stories confirming that there's many cases of Russian soldiers raping and abusing civilians who were behind their lines. So that was kind of in my mind when we were going through these houses, when the soldiers were going through the Russian equipment that was left behind. They'd found several boxes of condoms, which there's nothing damning in that. That's just something that, a little kind of light bulb goes on your head. This one house that they searched had what looked like to be a parent's room, and then another room that was very clearly belonging to a little girl. And they cleared it. I took this photo of the wall just outside of the little girl's room because I wanted to have it translated. Later on, this is translated as saying "I" or "we love you" in Russian. With Russian grammar, it's hard to tell whether it's I or we, I guess. Again, writing in Russian that's not indicative of anything. A lot of older Ukrainians only write in Russian. Almost all Ukrainians speak Russian. Just kind of a sort of thing that, as a journalist, is a small detail, and later on gives you a lot of, you wind up returning to quite often. That was the final installment for Esquire was that series of towns that were taken by the volunteer battalion. Just before I returned to the United States, I went back to Nova Basan, this town, and was met by these guys running their own checkpoint at an abandoned bulldozer. They were basically, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, Robert, these are babies.
Yeah, these are kids. I think the oldest one was 11.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, to me, children, especially boys, play soldier all over the world. It was almost like heartwarming to see these kids playing out, a fantasy part in all this. They were sadly like the only ones really left in the town. There was less people there a month later than there were the day of the liberation. And a lot of that was just the amount of Army guys you had running around and volunteer battalion guys running around. But a lot of it was that people don't feel safe going back to their homes. A lot of people are now so far away from their homes that they can't come back in a hurry. And a lot of other people don't have homes to come back to anymore.
Yeah. So the only real weapon here is the bazooka, right?
Right. Which is, and it's a tube. So it's like for carrying a rocket. It's not actually something that you could ever fire or weaponize. But to me, I'm ending on this one because it's kind of like, this is what kids do all over the world. And, as I'm now like no longer in Ukraine thinking about this, how many of the, adults that I saw fighting in the current conflict were this age when Russia originally invaded? Will these guys grow into adulthood and wind up being fighters on another front line somewhere? And, what does this kid's future look like? They had 2 years of COVID to deal with, and now they've got a war that's demolished their town. Are these guys going to be galvanized into ultra nationalists? Like there's so many questions. But there's also something beautiful in that, like, these kids were not comatose on the ground. They were finding a kind of proactive and fun way to have fun and be distracted. But yeah, that's what I left on. I don't really have a good reason for having gone back to Nova Basan. Like right before I left, I guess I just wanted to see, like, has life returned? Is are things getting back to normal? Is it still, is it still a mess? This is one of the few times I went out and didn't really have a clear idea what I was after in my head. But I came back with these kids, and I really enjoy that image, and it raised a lot of questions for me.
And so, Robert, are you planning on going back?
I'm planning on going back. I'd very much like to go back. I stayed so much longer than I originally planned that I now have at least a month of other work I now have to do. So I think I said this before, but I simultaneously hope that in a month this war is over.
Yeah.
But if it's not, then I definitely like to go back and just keep track of the guys that I got to know in bedding and see how the more kinetic fighting is going in the East.
And is it easy to track down that group again, Robert?
Yeah, I mean, surprisingly different units have different standards, but the volunteer battalions are, they're very tied to visibility and public fundraising. So the volunteer battalions are very, not necessarily open to operational details, but they're very open about what they're doing, and they're very aggressively involved because that's why they're there. And it's also what enables them to get, better medical supplies, new equipment, and things like that. The Ukrainian Army, on the other hand, really challenging. I think I've only seen 2 embeds with them since the beginning of the invasion. They've been very closed off to journalists, which is out of liability and safety concerns, and I think also information security. So they're much more secretive. No one in the Ukrainian Army is going to tell you really what's going on or give you any details or be open to embeds. So I think that may be changing.
Yeah. If anyone else has any questions, unmute everybody, Jay. If anyone else has a question, now is the time. And I mean, when you say you think the war will be over, is that wishful thinking, Robert, or is that just a sense of what's going on the ground?
I think, unfortunately, that's wishful thinking. I certainly hope it's over in a month. I think, the Ukrainians have made just the amount of progress they've made in the way that they fought. Like, no one could have forecasted anything as optimistic as that. But I feel like it's a fact that as things shift farther east, the Ukrainians are going to be up against more entrenched positions. A population that is not 100% in their favor, and also fighting against people who've had years to decide how they're going to defend the land that they've occupied. So I think it's optimistic, but I also hope I'm wrong.
Yeah, that's what I mean, John. John had a question about why you were thinking that.
Oh yeah, go ahead. Lay it on me.
No, but John put that in the chat room, so I was just.
Oh, okay.
Trying to flush that out. So that's a terrific presentation. I mean, very, your commentary around it makes us, and that's what's great, feel like you're there, with what you're going. And this image is to see this image, a year from now, where these young boys end up and how, time will weather them, right? I mean, in such a way.
And how it's going to shape, how it's going to shape their, how it's going to shape their mindset. I think of like growing up in the 9/11 generation, in the United States, and like what would our current politics be if that hadn't happened and galvanized people, in a certain way, in a very like emotional way. It's really hard to say. There are these young kids. There's also, I ran into so many, 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds who were really trying to get their hands on weapons and join the fight. There's one kid, I couldn't include his photo because it's for a later story that's not yet published. He was 15, and he told me he'd been training since he was 7 because he saw his father go fight when the 2014 invasion happened. And like, that's already a kid who's dedicated more than half of his childhood for preparing for what he saw as a inevitable war.
Right.
And he was the one that I met that had actually succeeded in getting into a unit, being armed, and was training with the NLAW system. So like he was really serious, and he's probably going to find his way, if he hasn't already, onto the front lines.
Right. Anyone else have any questions? Let's stop sharing, Robert.
Okay. Hold on. I can find my mouse. There we go.
There you go.
I'm going to bring up this. Oh, there's the chat. Okay.
Right. If anyone else has any questions, throw them in there. But no, that was a terrific presentation. With witnessing what you did, you made us feel like, unfortunately, like we were there. Yeah, Melody.
Well, I'm glad to share. I hope I got some things across and kind of explain some things. Hopefully there's some little revelations.
Yeah, no, our Melody, of course, loves it very much.
She's like my mentor. She was she was in this way before I was, and
you can mentor me now if you wanted to, if I wanted to go into war photography, but not really.
I think you'd be good at it because you're very calm and collected.
Maybe not war. I would like to do maybe more photojournalism, but we'll see. We can.
Melody, where do you work, Melody?
I'm a freelancer.
Okay.
I'm like at home in my t-shirt. I'm a freelance photographer. I live in New York, but I do mostly stuff around the fashion weeks, like street style and backstage, and that's how I met Robert.
In London,
hey, Robert, that's an
2014.
interesting question, Robert. How do you go from fashion world to this world?
Well, I'm gonna go with that. I got like very, very lucky, and if I didn't make this point in the presentation, I'd say like I got very lucky. I've been focused on journalism for a long time, but I could probably condense all of the pieces I've done to like 2 very busy months for any other photojournalist. But I've been doing a lot of like travel and fashion stuff since like 2014, I think I started. And in 2017, I'd finished up school and I just wasn't really getting a lot of juice out of working in fashion. It was like a lot of travel, and it was all kind of blurring together. And I met the then roommate of my former Marine Corps teammates, TM Gibbons Neff, TM Neff he's now with the New York Times, runs the Kabul bureau. At the time, he's with the Washington Post. And I met him at I think it was a party. I think it was a party in DC. And he was showing me like GoPro footage of him running from position to position in Donbass in Ukraine. And then put together this really incredible story about Ukraine. And I looked at him and I was like, man, the writing is great, but like the photos are really bad. And he just said, I didn't have a photographer. So we did, we took some iPhone photos and this, and I didn't know anything about journalism at all.
Right.
And I told him, hey, if you ever need a photographer, like I think I would try this, not knowing anything about it. He called me several months later. I think it was like 5 or 6 months later, and said, I'm going to northern Iraq to photograph to report on taking Mosul back from ISIS. And I was totally terrified, but I was like, man, I said I'd go, so I guess I'm going. And
Really?
I went out there with him, and I wasn't even overtly really interested. It sounded, a little bit exciting, but mostly terrifying. But it said I would do it, so I went, and it was such satisfying work. Like, it was so good to know that you were working towards, even if it was a small 0.0001% chance, like a chance at informing the world in a better way, telling a story that otherwise wasn't going to be told. And that was so fulfilling and so satisfying that like I couldn't go back to fashion after that. There's still a lot in fashion I enjoy. Yeah, there's still a lot of things in fashion that I enjoy, and I still enjoy that work. Not something that I think I need. I think I personally need both of these things. So
no, that's right. That's right. Well, I have to say, Robert, you kicked off this week just perfectly, absolutely perfectly.
Happy to help, and thanks for having me.
For everyone, and like I said, we have Tuesday and Wednesday, and then Friday of this week of more presentations. So we invite everyone to come back. You could use the same Zoom link. And we thank you so much, Robert. Great job. And, you have a standing invitation to come back anytime, with new work. We'd love to see it. In fact, if you ever want, you show your fashion work to see
absolutely.
the other side of the world.
There's some weird intersections there, trust me. But guys, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. Really appreciate your time. If anyone has any questions that they didn't get to, my contact information is up there. So just send me an email, send me a message, whatever the case is.
Great. So everybody, thank you very much. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Beautiful photos. Thank you.
Wonderful presentation.
Yeah, and we'll see you later in the week. Again, Robert, thank you, and everybody be safe and be well, and we'll see you tomorrow night.
All right, guys. I'm gonna sign off. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Robert. Good night.